So the last of our videos looks at strict liability, and it's probably slightly more complex than some of the other areas that we've looked at, like transferred malice and coincidence. And therefore we may spend a wee bit longer looking at strict liability. And I've used this image in the middle, the Smedley's Marrowfat process peas, because as we'll see in a moment, there is quite a famous case involving Smedley's peas in which strict liability is applied. So the easiest way to start to explain what is quite a complex issue really is to go back to our liability equation. And if you remember and recall, we need three things. We need to show that there's actus reus present, we need to show that there is mens rea present, and that's either in the form of intention or recklessness, and we need to show an absence of defence before we can say the defendant is criminally liable. Now let's come back to the mens rea element, because here this use of the word or gives us a key clue as to what we mean by strict liability. In short, it means that actus reus plus mens rea or strict liability, and the absence of defence, leads to criminal liability. Now what that or suggests is that it's mens rea or strict liability, which means that a crime of strict liability is one in which no mens rea is needed. So what we're going to do for the rest of this video is to look at on which situations will crimes be considered strict liability and why. And in these crimes, just performing the act is sufficient to show liability. So just performing the act. And I'll give you a brief example. If we think about speeding, and we are caught by a speed camera, there is no element of mens rea present. Well, there doesn't have to be any element of mens rea present in order for you to be found guilty, to receive your fine and to get 3 points on your licence. The act of merely speeding is sufficient for you to be found guilty. It doesn't matter what you were thinking. The act or actus reus of that is the speeding itself. And just by speeding, you have criminal liability. There is no need to show that you intended to speed. All that it needs to be shown is that you were speeding. So most of the crimes that strict liability is applied to are those that we would see and society sees as probably regulatory. Lots of traffic crimes, lots of crimes to do with business and the way that business operates. Most of them we wouldn't see as being crimes ourselves if we were asked. And I think the general consensus, for instance, is that most people wouldn't think that speeding or parking or driving without a seatbelt on were crimes. They would see them as regulations. And the defendant doesn't even have to be aware of essential matters that are relevant to the crime. And there's a case that we'll look at over on the other side in a moment when we look at examples, which is the Harrow London Borough Council versus Chartres. And in that case, the shopkeeper sells a lottery ticket to a person under the age of 16. Even if he doesn't know, even if he thinks that that person is in his mid-20s, he is still liable if the child is under 16 and he sells them a ticket. The act is to sell the ticket to somebody under 16. And even if he truly believes that that individual is over 16, it makes no difference. They will be found liable. So in that case, selling a lottery ticket to a person under 16, even if they did not know the age of the customer, they are still liable, because in that case, the offence is one of strict liability. So let's very briefly look at why strict liability comes about. And it takes us back to the Industrial Revolution. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution, huge growth in factories and businesses, which meant that there were some health and safety issues, let's be fair, particularly around workers. And workers were not necessarily treated well. Life in factories was dangerous for workers, so the workers needed protection. The problem with protecting workers through using criminal law is that it was very difficult to show that factory owners had any intent. And if we can't show intent, then essentially we can't prove any element of criminal liability. Another reason is perhaps that the people that made decisions about the law, particularly the magistrates, were generally factory owners themselves, and therefore were unlikely to find intent for other factory owners in situations that they themselves could be found guilty of. So Parliament decided that it would legislate, and it would remove, in some of these instances, particularly where it was about protection of workers, it would remove the issue of intent and make these cases of worker protection strict liability. And interestingly enough, where that happened, factory safety improved. So where you didn't have to prove intent, factory safety improved, which tends to suggest that it worked in certain circumstances, and it also tends to suggest that, or it tells us why we still have some form of strict liability now. So let's have a look what our current position is, and how do we know when an offence is one of strict liability? What is the statutory requirement? Well, our starting point for this is in 1970, and it's a case called Sweet versus Parsley. And Mrs. Sweet is a school teacher, and she owns a cottage, a country cottage, which she lets out to students. And she should be guilty for an offence for that in itself, letting it out to students. What was she thinking? But she lets this out to students, and unbeknown to her, the students are in their cottage smoking grass and anything else that goes. She rarely visits the cottage. When she does visit, she only collects mail. She has a locked room that she just stays in, and she has absolutely no idea that they were taking drugs. And the question was whether or not she could be held strictly liable for allowing her premises to be used for the purposes of drug taking. And the courts made it very clear. The courts said that, and this is a direct quote, whenever a section is silent as to mens rea, there is a presumption that, in order to give effect to the will of Parliament, we must read in words appropriate to require mens rea. And what that means is, unless the statute absolutely says, so unless the statute that is written says this is a case of strict liability, the presumption will be that mens rea is required. And because the Drug Act to which this applied did not state that it was a strict liability case, Mrs. Sweet was acquitted and found not guilty. So the starting point for us as of 1970 is that the statute has to say that it is an offence of strict liability. What happens then is that there is a later case in 1985 which helps us to look at the criteria to decide whether or not a crime can be one of strict liability. All right, so it builds on Sweet versus Parsley. And the other thing, of course, is this is a Hong Kong case, so it's a case that's done in the Privy Council. It isn't binding in this country, but what it does do is it gives us some very clear guidance to help us. And it's Gammon Hong Kong Limited versus AG for Hong Kong, the Attorney General for Hong Kong, 1985. And as you can see here, do you like what I've done? Used a bit of gammon to use as a picture illustration. And what it says there very, very clearly is that 5 key steps. The first step is that there should always be a presumption in law that mens rea is required before a person can be held guilty of a criminal offence. Well, that's straightforward. We know that. There is a presumption of mens rea. And we also know that that's partly the Sweet and Parsley, one of the things of the Sweet and Parsley ruling. The next stage is to say the presumption is particularly strong where the offence is truly criminal in character. So that presumption, that need for mens rea, is particularly strong when the offence is truly criminal. The presumption applies to statutory offences and can be displaced only if this clearly, or by necessary implication, the effect of the statute, or it's implicated in the statute. And again, that's building on the Sweet and Parsley ruling. The fourth element is the only situation in which the presumption can be displaced is where the statute is concerned with an issue of social concern and public safety is such an issue. So if there is a key problem with public safety, then the courts can possibly make that offence one of strict liability. And finally, even where a statute is concerned with such an issue, the presumption of mens rea stands unless it can also be shown that the creation of strict liability will be effective to promote the objects of the statute by encouraging greater vigilance to protect the commission of the prohibited act. So the idea is that everything, what Gammon does is show how attached strict liability is to public safety. All right, and we'll have a look at that by looking at some key examples. And I've got 4 key examples for you. The first is Alpha Sal versus Woodward. And in Alpha Sal versus Woodward, the defendants are paper makers who pollute a river because their pubs get blocked. And they are automatically found liable because it's an offence of strict liability. Their fine is only £20. And you might say, well, that's tiny, what's the point? Well, to the defendants, the cost is in the court, in taking the case to court, or defending the case in court, putting right the damage, and also the bad publicity that comes about. So the cost is far greater than the cost that the court gives them. The court recognises that it's not criminal and there's no intent, so it gives them a small fine. The problem for the business is that it has to put those things right, and that will cost it much more. In Smedley's versus Breed in 1974, a caterpillar is found in a tin of processed peas. And what that does is it contravenes the Food and Drugs Act 1955 about selling foods that are fit for consumption. They are automatically liable because the Act says that every thing that the public consumes must be fit for consumption. We've already looked at London Borough and Shah and the idea of selling a lottery ticket to an under 16, regardless of what we know about that individual, is an automatic, gives us automatic liability. And finally, we've got Blake, which is a 1997 case, and Blake has an unlicensed radio station. The defendant has no idea that the radio is broadcasting out to the general public, but nevertheless, he is found liable because it's an issue of public safety. The airwaves need to be kept clear for the emergency services and other people to be able to use to help us be safe. So, finally, the reasons. What are the reasons for strict liability? Well, in the first instance, it's easy to prove. Most court time, most evidence that is collected will go to show whether the defendant had mens rea or not. If you think about it, it's easy to show the actus reus of a murder. Somebody's dead or they are not. Showing what the defendant meant at the time is much more difficult. If you remove that necessity, it is easier to prove. And because it makes it easier to prove, it takes less time in court. So that's our second reason. All of that encourages compliance with the law. If you know that there is no way out, just by doing the act, you will be found liable. It forces you to comply more with the law. It prevents you using a defence as an excuse. If you know that all that you have to do is to complete the act, there is no defence that you can use, and therefore it stops people trying to get away with things that they should be liable for. It makes regulation straightforward, and if we look at some of the things that we've spoken about, how difficult it is to define oblique intent and recklessness, then it makes it much more straightforward to be able to say, well, we'll get rid of those, and just the act will be enough. And finally, the key thing is that it protects the public. Every strict liability offence should protect the public. And if we think about these down here, river pollution, what we eat, stopping our children from gambling and keeping the airwaves safe for emergency vehicles is all about public safety and public protection. Now, that is a quick whiz through. It is a complex subject and much deeper than I have just whizzed through at the moment. There are some key issues about strict liability, and they are key legal issues about the presumption of innocence, about having to show that you have the mens rea, that you have the guilty mind. All of those cause us some problems, but they're not things that we're going to look at on this video.